The papers slid across the glass desk with the sound of sandpaper scraping bone. He didn't look at me when he said it, just leaned back in his leather chair, eyes fixed on the skyline behind him, and let the words fall like he'd rehearsed them in the mirror. You're yesterday's news. That was it. No build-up, no preamble. 26 years condensed into 4 words, clipped and dismissive, delivered with the confidence of someone who thought the future belonged to him. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I shook his hand, smiled like it was the end of a casual meeting, and slid the termination papers into the folder he'd placed beside me. My fingers didn't tremble. My pulse didn't quicken. But somewhere deep inside, where numbers and names and contracts lived, something shifted. A cold clarity. My name is Edward Cade. I'm 53 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was Senior Executive Vice President of Strategic Development at Harrington Global. To most, that title is a blur of boardroom jargon. But here's the truth. I generated 61% of the company's annual revenue stream. Not my team, not my department. Me, my deals, my structures, my foresight. 26 years of carving profits out of chaos, pulling entire divisions back from collapse, outmaneuvering competitors that were ready to eat us alive. I built Harrington Global into what it is today. And this boy, this new CEO the board brought in, because they were dazzled by his TED Talk bravado and Silicon Valley charm, was erasing me with the stroke of a pen. His name doesn't matter. His youth does. He had the kind of face that still looked damp from graduation, hair slicked back in a style he thought screamed authority. He wore sneakers with his suit, called everyone buddy, and he thought the company was his playground. I sat there while he droned on about vision and agility, about needing leadership that lives in the now. His words rolled off me like rain on tempered glass. He had no idea what the now even meant. I'd lived through crashes, recessions, regulatory wars, corporate espionage. I'd steered Harrington through storms that would have sunk every glossy startup he worshipped. When the market bled red in 08, I was the one who found the artery to stitch. When competitors tried to gut us with hostile bids, I was the one who countered and left them in pieces. And I hadn't done it for glory. I wasn't the type to chase magazine covers or speeches. I worked in shadows, pulling threads nobody else could even see. Quiet power. The kind that kept shareholders fat and executives in their corner offices. I thought loyalty meant something. I thought building the foundation would keep me anchored. I was wrong. I remembered the nights I'd slept on the office couch during a merger crisis, tie loosened, shoes off, eyes burning from staring at data until dawn. I remembered missing my daughter's piano recital because I was in Tokyo convincing a partner not to pull the plug on a billion-dollar deal. I remembered the surgeries I delayed because the company needed me whole in a room full of sharks. Every sacrifice stacked like bricks. And in the end, the kid across the table knocked it all down with a smirk. But I didn't show him any of that. Not the bitterness, not the betrayal. That wasn't my way. Silence was always my sharpest weapon. So I stood, shook his hand again, and said only 3 words. Good luck, kid. Then I turned, walked out of the office I'd practically built, and left him with the illusion that he'd won. What he didn't know, what the board didn't know, is that my fingerprints are on every artery of this company. The contracts, the clients, the systems that keep Harrington Global breathing, I designed them. I know where the valves are hidden, where the pressure points live, where one twist can stop the heart. You don't erase 26 years with a signature. You just set the stage for consequences you don't understand. As I passed the reception desk, the young assistant gave me a look, sympathy, fear. She'd heard the whispers already. The board hadn't wanted this. They panicked when they saw the numbers. They knew cutting me loose was suicide, but they were too weak to stop him. That was fine. Let them panic. Let him gloat. He thinks I walked away. He doesn't know I stayed behind. The first night after they pushed me out, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and the same laptop I'd used for years, its casing worn smooth at the edges from 1,000 boardroom battles. They thought they'd stripped me of access when they deactivated my credentials, but they didn't know about the tunnels I'd built into Harrington's systems. 26 years of designing infrastructure leaves, fingerprints in places no IT manager could scrub. They never even saw the doors I left open because I'd buried them beneath layers of legitimate code, hidden in the margins of compliance updates, disguised as harmless database calls. I had keys to locks they didn't even know existed. The first thing I pulled up was the private server log. Not the sanitized version the auditors reviewed, but the raw feed stored on a mirror I'd created in Singapore years ago during an acquisition. Every transaction, every contract draft, every client interaction that passed through the company had a shadow copy there. While the boy CEO strutted around with his buzzwords, I had the receipts. Data is power, and I'd hoarded enough to make emperors bow. Still, data alone isn't a guillotine. It's the blade. You need a frame to hold it steady, a rope to release it at the right time. That frame was my network, not Harrington's, mine. Over the decades, I'd cultivated a web of clients who weren't loyal to the brand, but to me personally. Men and women who'd trusted me with their fortunes when everything was on fire. I'd been their shield when the markets collapsed, their knife when competitors circled, their architect when they needed a fortress. They picked up my calls because they knew I never wasted words. That kind of trust doesn't transfer with a new CEO's handshake. I remembered the battles that forged those bonds. The hostile takeover in 1999 when I stayed in the office for 72 hours straight, countering bid after bid until the predator bled out. The competitor in Frankfurt, who thought they could choke us with supply line manipulation, I flipped their own vendors in 2 weeks and left them bankrupt. The regulatory trap in D.C., when senators smelled blood and circled with subpoenas. I rewrote the language in the contracts myself and shoved it down their throats until they backed off. Those scars bought loyalty. The kid in sneakers thought leadership was charisma. He'd never been in a room where silence and timing kept the company from bleeding out. He didn't know war. Contracts are battlefields too, and I wrote most of them. I laced clauses into agreements like tripwires, payment structures that shifted with market indexes, termination fees calculated in ratios so complex no outside counsel ever untangled them. I wasn't protecting myself when I wrote them. I was protecting the company. Or at least I believed I was. Now those same clauses were mine to detonate. No one else knew where they were, let alone how to disarm them. One word from me to the right client and entire revenue streams would freeze like arteries clogged with ice. The company still looked stable from the outside. Reports clean, earnings predictable, stock hovering steady. But I could see the fault lines beneath the surface. I'd mapped them myself, like a miner memorizing every crack in the tunnel walls. Harrington was a giant, but giants topple when you kick the right knee, and I knew exactly where to aim. I didn't need noise. I didn't need headlines. The boy at the top thrived on attention, on applause from rooms that loved buzzwords more than results. My power was silence. I moved through it like a surgeon's scalpel, sharp, unseen, and absolute. So I reached into the system and made the smallest adjustment. 1 decimal point shifted in a ledger no one else would think to question, in a contract with a supplier whose loyalty belonged to me. It was nothing, invisible, just a breath of change. But in 30 days, the discrepancy would bloom into a shortage, a missed target, an investor's doubt. I closed the laptop, drained the bourbon, and leaned back in my chair. The guillotine didn't need to fall yet. It just needed to be built. I didn't need to touch him. I just needed to move 1 decimal point. He stood under the spotlight with that smug grin plastered across his face, sleeves rolled to the elbows like he'd invented the concept of casual authority. The crowd clapped when he tossed out buzzwords like innovation and disruption, and he soaked it up as if applause could substitute for profit. I watched the feed from my living room, the television's glow flickering across a glass of untouched scotch. He talked about the future of Harrington Global as if the past 26 years had been dead weight. He promised exponential growth, bold pivots, new horizons. But behind the camera's polish and the stage lights, the foundation was already starting to crack. The first fracture was small, invisible to anyone outside the circle. A key client in Zurich quietly declined to renew a contract worth 9 figures. Publicly, they cited strategic realignment. Privately, they called me. Their loyalty wasn't to Harrington, it was to me. And when I suggested they take their money elsewhere for now, they didn't hesitate. That was the difference between his world and mine. He courted audiences. I cultivated loyalty. 2 weeks later, another fissure opened. A competitor in Toronto announced a sudden surge in capacity, doubling their market share almost overnight. It looked like a miracle, but I'd brokered it myself through a network of suppliers who owed me favors buried deep in old contracts. While the boy CEO strutted across stages, I shifted resources like pieces on a chessboard. His kingdom was being hollowed out, and he hadn't noticed the termites chewing through the beams. The board did, though. They started calling emergency sessions after hours, their confidence leaking like water through cracked glass. I imagined them sitting around that long mahogany table, whispering about missed projections and unexplained client losses, casting nervous glances at the empty chair where I used to sit. They'd wanted fresh blood. Now they were choking on it. I stayed silent, detached, watching like a surgeon who'd already mapped the veins he planned to cut. I knew where the skeletons were buried, because I'd buried them myself. Every hidden liability, every delicate clause, every handshake deal sealed in hotel rooms at 2 a.m. I'd built the company on those bones, layer by layer, deal by deal, and now I was unearthing them one at a time, feeding them back into the system until the stench became too strong to ignore. The CEO felt it, even if he couldn't name it. His speeches grew sharper, his voice a little too tight, his smile a little too rehearsed. Behind closed doors, he lashed out. Employees were fired for minor errors. Managers were grilled in humiliating meetings. He stalked the halls looking for traitors, convinced sabotage was at play, but blind to the hand guiding it. He swung wildly, firing blanks into the dark, and every missed shot made him weaker. Watching him unravel reminded me of a lesson I'd learned long before Harrington Global. In my 20s, I wasn't wearing suits and ties. I was running operations in markets that made Wall Street look tame. Back then, when rivals felt cornered, they didn't fight smarter. They fought themselves. Panic was more lethal than any blade. I'd seen gangs implode, competitors devour their own, simply because fear gnawed deeper than hunger. The boy was no different. He thought he was hunting me, but he was tearing chunks out of his own flesh. I let him bleed, piece by piece, fracture by fracture, until the gleaming tower he'd built on stage lights started to look less like glass and more like ice. Brittle, transparent, ready to shatter. He thought he'd survived the worst of it. He thought the lost contracts and the nervous board were the full storm. But he hadn't even seen the blade yet. The silence was almost sweet, not the kind that comes with peace, but the kind that presses down on a room just before the blade falls. Harrington Global was hemorrhaging millions, the numbers sliding downhill in reports dressed up with corporate spin no one believed anymore. Clients whispered, investors rumbled, and the board staggered under the weight of questions they couldn't answer. On paper, the company still stood, but I could see it swaying, cracks spidering through the foundation. Every move I made was buried in coincidence. Every fracture looked natural. That was the beauty of it. They'd never trace the ruin back to me. The boy at the helm couldn't see it. He walked through the corridors with that same swagger, but his smile had grown brittle, his tone sharp enough to cut. He thought volume equaled strength. He thought if he barked loud enough, the panic would recede. Instead, it spread faster. Shareholders began calling their own private meetings, no longer satisfied with the fairy tales he fed them. They leaked frustrations to the press, planting stories about mismanagement, questioning his vision, his competence, his worth. The shine was fading, and underneath was nothing but bone. The board members who once cheered his arrival now contradicted him openly. In interviews, they spoke of alternate strategies and emergency considerations. Their phrasing was careful, but I knew the language of betrayal when I heard it. They were no longer protecting him. They were positioning themselves for what came next. Every hour that passed, his circle shrank. He hadn't lost the company yet, but it was already slipping from his fingers, like water through a cracked glass. I watched from the shadows, my fingerprints wiped clean. To him, it must have felt like fate turning cruel, like the market itself rising against him. But I knew better. I had set the storm in motion. The lost contracts, the surging competitors, the clauses I'd written years ago now detonating in sequence. None of it was luck. It was design. The kind of design you learn from years in trenches, fighting battles, not in front of cameras, but in rooms where every wrong word cost millions. He thought he was fighting bad luck. He was fighting me. And still, it wasn't just business. That's what stung the most. I could have walked away quietly, built something new with the knowledge I carried. But his betrayal cut deeper than a termination letter. I remembered the nights when my daughter asked why I missed her recitals, the birthdays celebrated with phone calls from hotel rooms, the dinners where I stared at spreadsheets instead of her smile. I remembered the friendships that withered because I could never make time, the health scares I ignored because a deal demanded my attention. I traded pieces of my life for the company, believing the sacrifice meant permanence. And then, in one gesture, the boy erased it. He looked at 26 years of loyalty and saw nothing but clutter to sweep away. That was why I stayed. Not for the money, not for the power, but because he had to learn that arrogance carries a cost. You don't dismiss the man who built the fortress and expect the walls to stand. The escalation came to a head when the board called an emergency meeting. It was announced quietly, after hours, but I heard about it within minutes. My network never slept. The boy thought he still held control, thought his title and his stage presence were enough to intimidate the old guard into submission. He walked into that meeting believing he was untouchable. He didn't know the ground had already been hollowed beneath him. I sat alone that night, the city lights bleeding through the blinds, savoring the stillness. The silence before the execution was always the richest. Tomorrow the facade would collapse. Tomorrow the board would turn on him, the way he had turned on me. Tomorrow they'll hand him the same papers he handed me. Only this time, the pen will bleed. He strutted into the boardroom like a man stepping onto a stage, his sneakers squeaking against the polished wood, his grin carved into that same arrogant mask. He greeted the directors with a breezy wave, cracked a joke about old money getting nervous, and dropped into the chair at the head of the table as though it had been built for him. He didn't notice the silence that followed. He didn't feel the weight in the air, heavy and expectant, like the room itself was holding its breath. For all his talk of living in the now, he was blind to the moment he was actually standing in. I was already there, sitting at the far end, not in a suit, but in the kind of understated attire that blends into the background. He hadn't seen me walk in, hadn't considered that I still belonged in the room. His eyes finally landed on me, and for the first time since I'd met him, his grin faltered. He tried to cover it with a smirk, but the crack showed. The chairman cleared his throat, papers shuffling softly against the oak. "We're here to address the current state of Harrington Global." His voice was steady, but the undertone was sharp. Around the table the others nodded, their expressions carved from stone. The boy CEO leaned back, confident, waiting for his chance to spin, to charm, to sell his narrative. But I knew the moment his empire collapsed had already passed. This was only the execution. The chairman began with numbers, losses mounting in Zurich, supply lines collapsing in Toronto, investors pulling out in New York. The kid tried to interject, rattling off excuses about markets, about shifting trends, about unforeseeable factors. But the voices around him cut sharper with each rebuttal. These weren't questions anymore. They were indictments. Then I spoke. Calm, measured, each word sliding across the table like a blade, drawn slow from its sheath. None of this is unforeseeable. You just didn't see it. Or maybe you didn't know where to look. His head snapped toward me, eyes narrowing, but I didn't break stride. I laid out the sequence. Clients who had left not because of market forces, but because they'd chosen me over him. Suppliers whose contracts he thought he owned, but whose clauses I'd written years earlier. Numbers that had shifted not by accident, but by design. The directors leaned in, listening, and for the first time, the boy realized the stage was mine. His voice cracked when he tried to shout me down. He accused me of sabotage, of betrayal, of orchestrating the collapse. His hands slapped the table, veins rising in his neck. But the truth is louder than rage, and the board saw it. They saw through him, past his tantrum, past the gloss that had fooled them months ago. They saw the carcass of a company he'd gutted with his arrogance. And they saw me, the man who had built it, dismantled it, and still sat unbroken. The chairman slid a folder across the table. Termination papers. The same gesture the boy had once used against me, only now the weight had shifted. He froze, staring at the pages as though they were written in a language he couldn't understand. He looked around the table for allies, but none met his eyes. He had no ground left, no rope to cling to, no applause to drown out the silence. I stood, slowly, deliberately. My chair scraped the floor like a gavel striking wood. I leaned forward, just enough for him to hear me over the ringing in his ears. You thought I was yesterday's news. Today, you don't even exist. His face drained, his hands trembling above the papers. I didn't stay to watch him sign. I didn't need to. The moment was sealed. His empire was ashes, his reputation in ruins, his wealth already scattering to the winds. There would be no recovery, no comeback, no shadow left of the boy who thought he could erase me. I walked out in silence, past the glass walls of the boardroom, down the corridor that still smelled faintly of polished wood and fear. Behind me, the voices rose, the coup cemented, the future rewritten. Ahead of me, the city waited, indifferent, sprawling, alive. He was finished, and I was free.